Welcome to Second Take, the show that focuses on the issues behind the news. Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan released the medium-term budget policy framework this week. Terence Creamer has gone through the documentation and joins me to discuss some of the key issues. Terence, welcome to Second Take. What were some of the main headline issues emerging from the mini-budget?
I think the headline that came out was really that we've allowed our deficit to slip from 5.3% to 5.5% this year. And we're also going to allow that deficit to remain higher next year, and that figure will stay at around 5.2% instead of falling to 4.8% during the next fiscal year. And that was really to create some fiscal space to allow the government's stimulus to continue into the economy, given that the momentum has been lost. And that's because we had to also revise, Pravin Gordhan also revised our growth outlook for this year and for the next few years, and that growth outlook has been moderated to 3.1% for this year, and it's basically an indication that a recognition that the momentum of the recovery has been lost, and the private sector, the baton that was going to be passed to the private sector to take up the sort of economic growth mantle has not been passed, and government has to stay active in the economy for longer. So I think those were the headline, the higher deficit and the lower growth, as well as the lower revenue, were the headline numbers, and to try create use what space we have remaining to keep the government active in the economy through about another 48 billion rand that will be injected through increasing that deficit over the next 3 years, and that will also allow us for the first time next year to have a R1 trillion plus budget that will come through in 2012-2013. So we're going to be a R1 trillion expenditure government economy from next year, which is quite a significant milestone, and it's going to obviously climb from here on out. But I think that was the headline, but I think the underlying theme of the budget was that we need to start shifting the composition of expenditure away from government consumption towards more investment, and specifically infrastructure investment at the national, provincial and municipal level. And that's easier said than done, because what we've seen over the last few years is the wage bill of government has really surged from around 30% of expenditure to over 40%, or close to 40% of government yearly expenditure now goes to salaries and wages of civil servants. And Pravin Gordhan was saying, as part of this shift, we need to have some moderation in the cost of living adjustments. And he actually put a marker down of 5.5%, which I'm sure is going to be highly contested when the unions engage with government, especially the fairly active and fairly robust public sector unions that have tended to strike over the last few years. But he's saying, we've had a major adjustment in government wages and salaries, and we now need to sort of moderate the rates of increase at around the 5% level. But he also put out the signal that moderation generally has to become a theme in government. We can't have cabinet ministers spending on luxuries, and I think coming in the week that President Zuma fired Sicelo Sexeka for just wasteful expenditure, extravagance, and also false information back into the government. I think it was another signal that government's had enough of that sort of behaviour, and we need to start reining ourselves in as cabinet ministers. And he says that needs to cascade down to leading government officials and down right through the civil servants, that we need to start being much more prudent in the way we spend taxpayer money, which I think is a very good signal. But he extended that to the private sector and saying we need to have moderation in executive bonuses and remuneration. And we need to, try and use that moderation to create the savings space for greater investment and creating growth, and generally shifting towards growth infusing investment activity in the economy, rather than this continual trend of raising the consumptive side of spending, both in the private sector as well as in the public sector, but specifically where he has some authority in the public sector.
There was also news that government is working on ways to further support the productive sector. What was said?
Yes, that was also new within the medium-term budget policy frame. Obviously, we wait for February for the details, but what we heard is that there's going to be an extra 25 billion over the next 6 years for the productive sectors of the economy, really for industrial development in South Africa. Now, that's fairly modest still. I mean, but what we must realise, it's over and above what's already in the budget. So we already have, big tax allowances for big projects. And we already have the automotive incentive schemes and the clothing and textile schemes and a number of generic incentives that are in place. So the 25 billion, as I understand it, will be over and above that. And he's saying that we need to find the resources within the 1.1 trillion rand that's going to be spent next year, going up to 1.3 trillion over the period per year. We need to be able to find within that envelope the money to fund this additional 25 billion over 6 years, so not over the 3 years, over the 6 years. So I think one of the things is it's still fairly parsimonious in terms of how big it is. It's not a large sum of money, but it's a good signal. I think the signal is that we're wanting to shift from consumptive expenditure to productive expenditure. We're wanting to support the productive side of the economy and create the basis for manufacturing, mining and beneficiation, as well as agriculture, to regain some traction. There was a big lament within the medium-term budget policy framework documentation about the poor performance of mining and manufacturing, specifically mining. I mean, we were in a sort of boom phase, and we've sort of again missed that boom with the outputs that we've seen during this year. Even though the terms of the prices have risen and our terms of trade has improved as a result, because the goods and services we export, the price of those are higher than what they were. We haven't really seen the volume uptick in mining that we should have seen, and what other countries like Brazil, like Australia and other resource-rich countries have really tapped into. So there was a large lament about that, and I think there was also a sideswipe at the issue of nationalisation that was made within that budget. But basically the signal of this 25 billion is almost as important as the number. The signal is that we have to start rebuilding the productive sectors of the economy that have been allowed to really be decimated over the last few decades. Now, that's great news for engineering news type readers, because that's the space that we work in, the space of building manufacturing again, building the productive side of the economy in terms of minerals beneficiation and in terms of agricultural production and value-added agricultural products. So I think that it's an important part of the shift that government is wanting to see over the next few years.
Finally, the issues of infrastructure development and underspending were again canvassed. Can you take us through what was said?
This has been a theme now for some time. In fact, around the world it's a theme. We need to, infrastructure has been allowed to deteriorate in many countries, and in South Africa is no exception. And we need to do a serious catch-up, because it's a constraint on the ability of the productive side of the economy to really grow. So we've got an envelope of 800 billion plus over the next 3 years that will be going into power and logistics, as well as water infrastructure. So it's a fairly significant investment, most of which is going to be done by the state-owned enterprises, but not only, and also government departments. But there are also some private projects coming into the mix through the renewable energies and through telecoms, and even the discussion around the toll roads and how we're going to finance that. So there is this big infrastructure push. And I think there's this feeling that we need to start really ensuring that those capital budgets are properly spent every year. Without fail, Eskom underspends. Transnet's probably a little bit less, but also has underspent. The government departments have underspent, but particularly at the provincial and the municipal level, it's even worse. So capital budgets at the municipal level, it's got to the point where something like 25% of these budgets are being rolled over. So municipalities are being very good at spending on the wrong things, on nice hotels and overseas trips that don't always make sense, and that was raised very candidly by the minister. But they haven't been so good at planning for their infrastructure, for those things that people are worried about in the township in terms of service delivery, but also the economic infrastructure that is so important for growth. And that was one of the points that was made because we are in this this difficult hot potato of how do we finance this infrastructure, because we having this fight or this muddle around the toll roads at the moment, especially in Gauteng, where there's a moratorium on the development of any more toll roads, and there's also a lot of uncertainty about how we're actually going to finally fund the Gauteng toll roads that are being nearly completed. And I think he made the point, the worst case scenario is actually not to build this new capacity, because the growth impact of that on the economy, of having congestion, of not having enough capacity of electricity, is really, creates a major burden on the economy. So that was the key point. We need to build. But the second point he made is we need to spend at the schedule that we set ourselves, especially at the municipal and provincial level. And then we need to find the correct, what he called the right balance of funding mechanisms between, the taxpayer and the user. Ultimately, it's the same people, but we're having to find a way of, for instance, the toll roads is a very contentious issue. Do we have this 40+ cents a kilometre for Gauteng immediately? What is that going to do for this a very important part of the South African economy in terms of raising the costs and inflation in this part of the world? And I think that there is a rethink, and he's part of that rethink, of how to find the balance between using the tax resources and user pay resources. And I think what we're going to see over the next few weeks and months is a solution to the toll road, which might also become a template for funding of other things. Now, whether that's going to be purely moving it as some want towards the taxpayer using the fuel levy, or whether it's going to be erring more on the side of the user pays, we're going to have to wait and see. But I think that what government is probably going to be moving towards is a more hybrid type model, where there's a recognition that the user has to pay a certain portion, but at an affordable rate, and that will look at the fiscus supporting in some way, probably through the fuel levy, the balance. But I'm just talking about toll roads in that instance, but it's not a unique to toll roads. We're going to have to be going through this funding challenge, whether it's power stations, and we've seen that we've already gone through that, where we had to bail out Eskom with sort of deeply subordinated loans, as well as guarantees, as well as tariffs, which is the user pay side. We're going to see it the same on the other logistics that are going to come in through transport or rail and these roads. And we're going to see it in other areas of this economy, right down possibly to water. So it is a challenge, but I think maybe having this big powwow around toll roads is an opportunity to come up with a template that gets that mix, that balance right. And it's going to be very interesting to see that balance eventually emerging.
Terence, thank you very much. That is the Second Take show for this week. Thank you for watching, and join us again next time for more news analysis.